In this episode of Getting Into D&D, we're going to cover the basics of spellcasting. One of the most varied and complex parts of D&D is casting spells, so I figured it deserved an episode all to itself. Spellcasting is an integral part of the gameplay for more than half of the classes in D&D. Each class has a bit of a different take on spellcasting. However, there are also many similarities in the way spells work. So the purpose of this video is to teach the basic mechanics in order to make spellcasting as easy to understand as possible. There are two main types of spells in D&D, cantrips and spells of first level or higher. Cantrips are basically weak or simple spells that are easily memorized and practiced often so that the caster doesn't need to expend spell slots or prepare them ahead of time in order to cast them. Because of that, you can cast any of your cantrips an unlimited number of times with no penalties. Spells with a level attached to them are more complicated. If a spell has a level, it will note it in the spell's description, along with the school of magic that the spell is from. The schools of magic don't play a huge part in spellcasting, so I'm not really going to go into depth on that. These spells also generally need to be prepared before they can be used. Spellcasters have a limited number of spells they can prepare each day, which means you can't cast every spell you know every day. Unless you have a special rule that allows you to, you can only prepare your spells after a long rest. In addition to preparing spells, you have a limited amount of magical energy to expend each day, and this is tracked using something called spell slots. The amount of spell slots you have is determined by your class level. Spell slots have levels like the spells they're used to cast. You can use higher level spell slots to cast lower level spells, but you can't use lower level spell slots to cast higher level spells. For example, the spell Burning Hands is a first level spell that does 3d6 fire damage. When you cast it, you have to use one of your spell slots. You can think of the spell as having a physical size determined by its level. A level 1 spell is, say, 2 inches long. A first level spell slot is also 2 inches long. When you cast a first level spell, it will fill that slot, and you won't be able to use the slot again until you finish a long rest. If you don't have a first level spell slot, you can cast it at a higher level, but the spell will still fill the whole slot. It sort of expands when you cast it. Some spells will become more powerful when they're cast at higher levels. Burning Hands is one of those, as you can see at the bottom of its entry. It says that it does an extra 1d6 fire damage per level higher than first. So if you cast it at level 2, it will do a total of 4d6 fire damage. Or if you cast it at level 6, it will do a total of 8d6 fire damage. Not every spell becomes more powerful when you cast it at a higher level, but regardless of the level you cast it at, or whether it will become more powerful in this way, any level spell will always fill an entire spell slot. If you wanted to cast a level 3 spell, you would only be able to if you had a spell slot of level 3 or higher, since the spell would be 4 inches long, and wouldn't fit in a level 1 or 2 slot. Spells and spell slots don't actually have a physical size. I was just using that as an example to help you visualize how they work. Okay, that's all about spell slots. Now let's talk about components. Every spell has necessary components to their casting. These might be as simple as speaking a magic word, known in D&D as a verbal component, or making a hand gesture, known as a somatic component. Or they might require physical materials, known as material components. Most spells will require some combination of these three things, and the spell entry will note what they are. If a material component is required, there will be a text description of what those materials are. If you have an item known as an arcane focus or a component pouch, you don't need to provide material components unless the materials have a specific cost associated with them. Once again, the spell entry will specify this. It's important to know what components are required, as some circumstances would prevent you from casting the spell. Using Burning Hands as an example again, the required components are verbal and somatic. The somatic component is that you have to hold your hands with your thumbs touching and your fingers spread. For example, if you're chained in a dungeon with your hands spread apart, you can't touch your thumbs together. Or maybe your fingers are magically bound together. Or there's some other physical circumstance that would prevent you from making the gesture described. In that case, you won't be able to cast the spell. If you're unable to speak for some reason, say the spell Silence is cast in your vicinity, You won't be able to perform the verbal component, and thus you can't cast the spell. Alright, that's all for components. Let's move on to targeting spells. Not every spell is an attack. Spells like Disguise Self, Shape Water, and Mending are spells that simply affect the things around you. Of those that are attacks, some require an attack roll to be made to see if they hit their target. If this is the case, it will be noted in the spell description as in the spell Firebolt. If an attack roll is not called for, the attack automatically hits, like in the case of Magic Missile. Often, especially when a spell automatically hits, the target will be allowed to make a saving throw against the effect. The spell entry will say what happens on a success or failure. Most cantrips will simply have no effect against a successful saving throw, and most other spells will do half damage. It's important to let your DM know if they're supposed to make a saving throw and which stat they're supposed to use, in order to help speed up combat and keep things moving. It's much better if they don't have to ask you or look it up in the rules. Next, let's talk about range and area effects. Most spells have a certain range at which they can be cast. In the case of Magic Missile, the range is 120 feet, which means you can target anything you can see within 120 feet of you. If the range is Touch, you have to touch whatever you're casting the spell on. If the range is Self, you can only cast the spell on yourself or from your position. Some spells have an area of effect. Area effects have a point of origin, and then they expand out for a certain distance from there. The spell Burning Hands has a range of Self, and in brackets, 15-foot cone. That means that the spell has to originate from your position, and it hits everything in an area covered by a 15-foot cone. There are 5 different types of area effect: a line, a cone, a cube, a sphere, and a cylinder. A line affects everything in its path from the point of origin to the distance defined by its area of effect. It also covers a defined width. For example, the spell Gust of Wind is a line going from you to a point 60 feet away, and it's 10 feet wide. A cone covers an area extending from the point of origin to the specified number of feet. It also grows wider as it travels, and it should always be the same in width as it is in length. Some people prefer to use rounded cones where the corners don't extend past the maximum length, but with a 3D object, a cone would look like a triangle from the top, so that's what I use. A cube's point of origin is anywhere on one of its faces. So for example, with the spell Thunderwave, the origin is you, and you can cast it to travel in any direction from there. The spell Hypnotic Pattern is also a cube, but the point of origin is anywhere within range, which in this case is within 120 feet of you. A sphere's point of origin is its center. Spheres are usually expressed as an X-foot radius, so it covers twice that distance. For instance, the spell Silence affects a 20-foot radius sphere, which would be 40 feet in diameter. A cylinder affects a radius similar to a sphere, but it usually has a particular height as well. For example, the spell Moonbeam has a 5-foot radius, but is 40 feet high. The point of origin has to be in the center of the circle, and always on one end of the cylinder, usually on the ground. For the line, cone, and cube, the point of origin isn't included in the area of effect unless you want it to be, but for the cylinder and the sphere it is included. Next, let's talk about casting time. The time it takes to cast a spell is listed at the top of the spell entry. If the time is listed as one action, that means it can be cast as your action during combat. If cast outside of combat, it shouldn't take more than a few seconds. Similarly, if the time is listed as one bonus action, then the spell can be cast as a bonus action during combat. If the time is listed as one reaction, as with the spell Featherfall, you can cast it as a reaction during combat. The duration of the spell is how long the effect lasts. Some are listed as instantaneous, which means they're over as soon as the effect has taken place. Others can last seconds, minutes, hours, days, even years. If the spell says concentration before the duration, then you have to maintain your concentration for the spell the entire duration in order for it to continue taking effect.
Inner peace Would whoever is making that flapping sound quiet down?
If you become incapacitated or die, you lose concentration. You may drop concentration instantly whenever you wish. If you take damage while concentrating, you have to make a Constitution saving throw to see if you maintain your concentration. The number you need to roll, or DC, is 10, or half the amount of damage you took, whichever is higher. And finally, if you cast another spell that requires concentration, you lose concentration on the first one. Otherwise, you can do whatever you like without breaking your concentration, including casting other spells, attacking, moving, and so on. The last thing to talk about for spellcasting is casting a spell as a ritual. In order to cast a spell as a ritual, first the spell has to have the ritual tag in its description. An example of this would be the spell Alarm. The ritual tag might appear as text in parentheses after the spell's school of magic and level, or it might appear as a letter R after the spell name, the way it does on D&D Beyond's spell entries. When casting a spell as a ritual, it will take an extra 10 minutes to cast, but it doesn't expend a spell slot. You can only cast a spell as a ritual if you already have it prepared. Okay, that's about it for spell mechanics. There are loads of different spells with all sorts of effects, so read through the options that your character has available to make sure that you're not missing out on something that could add a lot to your game. Outside of the features provided by your class and subclass, spells are one of the things that bring the most variation to the game. They play a huge part in making your character and your game completely unique. As always, if you have questions or comments, leave them down below. If you liked this video, leave a like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.